Those different factions united in 2004, and over the last 7 years have steadily expanded their reach across large parts of central and eastern India. And the rise of the Maoists has as its basis the dispossession and deprivation of India's tribal people. About 8% of India is tribal, which is about 90 million people. They live across a wide swathe of hill and forest in the center of the Indian peninsula. They live amidst India's best forests, along its fastest flowing rivers, and atop its richest mineral resources. And over the last 150 years, they have steadily had to make way for the growing urban industrial economy. It started with the British, who exploited the forests of the tribal area for building railways, for shipping materials for the two world wars. It carried on in the early years of independence, when under a regime of state planning, the government built massive hydroelectric projects, of which the main sufferers were the tribals, who lost their lands and their homes and their villages and their shrines and the associations. And it's continued in the 1990s and beyond, when India has embraced an outward-looking economic policy, which has its positive spin-offs, as in Bangalore, where globalization has used skilled capital and generated huge amounts of wealth and philanthropy, but which has also had this outward-looking Indian economic policy has also had rather brutal effects in the tribal homelands, where globalization has meant a massive surge in the exploitation of bauxite and iron ore, where tribals who have uncertain titles to their land have been shafted off by unscrupulous and corrupt politicians working in league with Indian and foreign mining companies. And it's this cumulative process of dispossession, of which I've given you a bare capsule summary, which I've written about at length elsewhere, which is at the root of the Maoist insurgency. Indian democracy has had room for subaltern or underprivileged classes. I mean, the Dalits or former untouchables are fairly well represented in the Indian political system. They are still exploited, they are still brutalized, but they have a voice in the constitutional democratic system. The chief minister of India's largest state is a Dalit woman, which is, who has overcome double disadvantage of caste and gender. The Muslims, who are a minority, who are largely poor, unskilled, who do face discrimination, also have had their concerns and their sufferings and their grievances addressed by political parties working within the democratic system. But the tribals are voiceless, and economic deprivation combined with political voicelessness has delivered them into the hands of the Maoists. And this civil war is very serious. 4 days ago, the Maoists killed 72 policemen in what was the largest such attack in the history of independent India. Some state governments have responded by promoting vigilante groups, setting one group of tribals against another. In one district I visited in 2006, the district of Dantewara in the state of Chhattisgarh, almost 100,000 people had been displaced because of this civil war. So that's the first major challenge facing the Republic of India, a serious Maoist insurgency, which at least in the short term will not go away, and which over the next 10 or 15 years will claim tens of thousands of lives. The second serious challenge is from the right. If you look at the evolution of liberal democracies in Europe, particularly in the interwar period, you find that democracy in Europe had to hold its ground. The liberal center had to hold its ground against Bolshevism or radical communism on the left and fascism on the right. Now, we don't have a full-grown fascist party, at least not yet, fortunately. We have what may be called quasi-fascist, proto-fascist, fascist-light party perhaps, known as the Bharatiya Janata Party, which has its roots in a kind of volunteer organization called the RSS, which was started in the 1920s to make Indian men macho, virile, physical, take up arms, preferably against Muslims and Christians and other minorities. The leaders of the RSS were admirers of Mussolini and Hitler. though that's a fact which they now seek to suppress and disavow. The BJP, which is the political manifestation of right-wing radical Hinduism, was in power in New Delhi between 1998 and 2004. It and its associated organizations are primarily responsible for the communal riots you mentioned, which have peppered the history of independent India, particularly from the 1980s onwards. Now, this was a challenge that India was bound to face, because when India became independent in 1947, it was divided at birth into the state of Pakistan, where faith was explicitly married with state. Pakistan was a Muslim homeland, where those who were not Muslims were effectively not first-class citizens. And hence, there was continual pressure and provocation on the political leadership in India to mimic the methods and legal structures and philosophy and ideology of Pakistan, and to construct India as a Hindu state. Now, fortunately, India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was greatly inspired by Gandhi, his master Gandhi, was determined not to follow this line. And he and his colleagues in the late 1940s and 1950s constructed the basis of a multi-religious secular state in India. But this multi-religious secular state in India was always vulnerable and fragile, and it continues to be so. So, you had, after Nehru's death in 1964, you had a burst of Hindu-Muslim rioting, partly caused by internal factors, partly caused by the persecution of Hindus in East Pakistan. In the 1980s, as many of you know, there was a dispute over in a small town in northern India called Ayodhya, where there's a mosque which radical Hindus claimed had been built on the site of a temple dedicated to the Lord Ram, and that dispute sort of spilled over into the streets and towns of north and western India. And between 1985 and 2002, which was the last major communal riot in India, that dispute must have claimed, I mean, no one has really can add up the statistics, but my estimate would be that dispute would have claimed more than 100,000 lives, rendered homeless more than 2 or 3 million people, and completely poisoned the political and social and moral atmosphere of India. Now, after the Gujarat riots of 2002, it appears that the right-wing religious fundamentalism is on the retreat. But this appearance should not lead to complacency. For one thing, if there is political instability or economic recession, it could come back again. For another thing, there is the provocation of Islamic radicalism, which exists. India has been subject to many terror attacks, which by Islamic fundamentalists, of which Bombay in 2008 was only the last. So, there is a threat from the left, there is a threat from the right. Now, as it happens, in the first years of Indian independence, India faced similar kinds of threat. Gandhi was murdered 6 months after independence by a Hindu fanatic, but because of Nehru and Patel, who was then Home Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, and a group of very committed secular intellectuals and politicians in office, Hindu fundamentalism was kept at bay. 6 weeks after Gandhi died, the Communist Party of India, acting at the behest of their Soviet masters, launched an armed insurrection against the Indian state. An insurrection that took 2.5 years to quell. So, at its birth, in its infancy, facing an extraordinary crisis, India was born against a background of privation, religious rioting, 10 million refugees had to be resettled, 500 princely states had to be integrated one by one. Against this background, you had a fragile, vulnerable center threatened, apart from poverty and illiteracy and all the other problems, threatened by a communist insurgency on the left and a right-wing Hindu assertion on the right. And these threats were met. They were contained, they were tamed by a highly committed and courageous group of public officials who persuaded the extremists to abandon their arms, to enter the democratic process,